My husband thought he was a mastermind when he filed for divorce while I was 3,000 miles away. He sent a picture of his 24-year-old mistress holding their newborn son to our family group chat with a simple message. He wrote that the locks were changed, my accounts were frozen, and I should not come back making a scene. He expected me to shatter. He expected me to call him sobbing and begging for an explanation. Instead, I took a slow sip of my bourbon, smiled at my phone screen, and typed a single word in response. All right. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an insecure man exactly who built the throne he sits on. I am Nia Washington, 34 years old, and the Chief Executive Officer of a corporate crisis management and mergers firm in Atlanta. I built my empire from the ground up, navigating boardrooms filled with men who constantly underestimated a black woman in a tailored suit. But the greatest underestimation did not come from my corporate competitors. It came from my own husband, Marcus. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta taught me hustle and resilience. But marrying into the Washington family introduced me to a world of fake wealth, endless pretension, and emotional manipulation. It was a crisp Tuesday evening in London. I was sitting in the penthouse suite of a luxury hotel overlooking the River Thames. The glow of the city lights reflected against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the soft patter of rain against the glass provided a quiet soundtrack to my victory. I had just spent the last 9 hours finalizing a massive international merger, the absolute crowning achievement of my career. I poured myself a generous glass of neat bourbon, ready to celebrate in the quiet elegance of my suite. That is when my phone screen lit up on the marble coffee table. First came the email. The subject line read simply, Washington versus Washington dissolution of marriage. It was from a discount law firm in downtown Atlanta, the kind of place that advertises on highway billboards and bus stops. I opened the attachment to find divorce papers filed by Marcus. My husband of 7 years was demanding half of my firm hefty spousal support and exclusive rights to our $3 million estate in Buckhead. Before I could even fully process the sheer audacity of his demands, my phone vibrated again. This time it was a notification from the Washington family group chat. The chat included Marcus, his mother Beatrice, his sister Tara, and her incredibly problematic white husband Brad. I opened the message and felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. It was a photograph. Marcus was smiling brightly in a hospital room, holding a newborn baby, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket. Leaning against his shoulder, looking exhausted but triumphant, was Chloe. She was 24 years old and used to be Marcus's intern at the real estate investment fund, where he worked as a senior director. Beneath the photo was a message from Marcus typed out for his entire family and me to see. He wrote, "Meet the new heir to the Washington legacy. Nia, my lawyer, sent you the papers. The locks at the house have already been changed. The joint accounts are frozen. Do not come back making a scene. You have your business, but I finally have a real family." I watched the read receipts pop up at the bottom of the screen. I watched as his mother Beatrice reacted to the photo with a heart emoji. I watched his sister Tara reply with a string of celebration emojis. I watched Brad, the white brother-in-law, who always tried too hard to use our cultural slang while dripping with microaggressions, send a message saying, "Congratulations, man, you deserve this." They were all in on it. They had all known. A normal wife would have dropped her phone. A normal wife would have collapsed onto the plush hotel carpet, hyperventilating and crying out in agony over the betrayal. A normal wife would have immediately dialed her husband's number, screaming and demanding to know how he could do this to her after 7 years of marriage. I am not a normal wife. I am a woman who handles corporate disasters for a living. I look at catastrophic failures, calculate the liabilities, and execute a ruthless strategy to come out on top. I looked at the photograph again. I looked at Marcus's smug, self-satisfied face. He actually thought he had won. He actually believed he had blindsided me, leaving me stranded and penniless in a foreign country, while he played house with his former intern in the mansion I paid for. He thought stripping me of my home and my supposed pride would finally make him the bigger, more powerful man in our dynamic. You see, Marcus was a man driven entirely by his own deep-seated insecurities. When we first met, my ambition was something he bragged about to his friends. But as my firm grew from a successful startup into an industry powerhouse, his pride began to fracture. He was a senior director making a very comfortable six-figure salary, but it was pennies compared to what I brought home. He hated that I paid the mortgage on the Buckhead estate. He hated that the luxury cars in our driveway were purchased with my bonuses. He hated walking into high society galas in Atlanta and being introduced as Nia Washington's husband. His mother Beatrice only fueled his toxic entitlement. She was a woman who prided herself on a manufactured high society image, constantly reminding me that I came from a working-class neighborhood. At every Thanksgiving dinner, she whispered in Marcus's ear that a real man should be the undisputed head of the household, planting seeds of resentment that grew into a dense forest of betrayal. Instead of stepping up and matching my energy, Marcus sought validation in the shadows. He needed someone small, someone easily impressed, someone who would look at his middle management title and his leased suits and think he was an absolute king. Enter Chloe, the naive, ambitious intern who was more than willing to stroke his fragile ego in exchange for expensive dinners and designer bags funded secretly by my hard work. I did not cry looking at that photo because I already knew. I found out about the affair 8 months prior. I had noticed a discrepancy in our joint account statements, a substantial withdrawal that he poorly disguised as a business consulting expense. I do not do anything halfway, so I hired an elite private investigator. Within 48 hours, I had a comprehensive file sitting on my desk. Photos of Marcus and Chloe entering boutique hotels, receipts for diamond necklaces, and ultimately, the medical records confirming Chloe was pregnant. When I read that file 8 months ago, the grief lasted exactly one night. I gave myself one single night to mourn the man I thought I married, to cry over the future I thought we were building together. When the sun came up the next morning, the grieving wife was gone. The chief executive officer took over. I knew confronting him back then would be a massive mistake. If I screamed and threw his clothes on the lawn, he would play the victim. He would hire aggressive lawyers, tie up my assets in a messy, protracted divorce, and try to drag my company's name through the mud out of pure spite. I was not about to let a mediocre man touch the empire I had bled to build. So I played the long game. I played the loving, busy wife while silently restructuring my entire financial existence. The trip to London was not just about acquiring a European competitor. It was my masterpiece. By dissolving my domestic corporate structure and rolling it into an overseas conglomerate, I had effectively shielded my life's work from any domestic family court disputes. My shares were now locked in an ironclad offshore trust. When Marcus filed those divorce papers today, he thought he was staking a claim to a $20 million gold mine. In reality, he was laying claim to a ghost company that no longer existed on paper. He thought the joint accounts were frozen because he called the bank this morning. He did not know I had drained the substantial funds from those accounts 3 days ago, leaving just exactly enough to cover the auto pay on his leased sports car. He thought he had locked me out of the house. He did not realize the house was never legally his to claim. As I stood in that London hotel room looking out at the city, I felt a deep, chilling sense of calm. Marcus wanted a war. He wanted to humiliate me in front of his snobby mother Beatrice, his freeloading sister Tara, and her insufferable white husband Brad. They had always treated me like an outsider, like my success was somehow an insult to their legacy. They wanted to see the strong black woman broken and begging for her life back. I looked down at the group chat one more time. The chorus of congratulations from his family was still pouring in. They were celebrating my supposed downfall. I tapped the screen and typed my single simple response. All right. I hit send, closed the chat, and tossed my phone onto the sofa. I finished my bourbon and set the glass down on the marble table. I walked over to my briefcase and pulled out the legal documents I had finalized that very afternoon. The paperwork that would not only protect my wealth, but absolutely obliterate his. Marcus thought he was the architect of my destruction. He had no idea he was just a pawn in my game. and I was about to sweep him off the board entirely. I picked up the hotel phone and called the concierge to book a first-class ticket back to Atlanta for the following morning. It was time to go home and show my husband exactly what happens when you try to bury a woman who owns the shovel. The first-class flight from London to Atlanta gave me 9 unbroken hours to perfect my posture, hydrate, and sharpen my absolute focus. I did not sleep for a single minute of that journey across the Atlantic. Instead, I reviewed every legal clause, every financial transfer, and every contingency plan I had put into motion. By the time my plane touched down on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, I was not a devastated woman returning to a broken marriage. I was a predator stepping into a hunting ground. I stepped out of the chauffeured Maybach, letting the heavy car door close behind me with a solid, expensive thud. I stood at the end of the pristine cobblestone driveway of my $3 million Buckhead estate. The warm Georgia air was heavy with humidity, but not nearly as heavy as the obnoxious bass thumping from inside my own home. Through the massive custom-designed bay windows, I could see the catered waitstaff weaving through a massive crowd. I saw towering silver balloon arches and a ridiculous gaudy banner welcoming the new baby. They were actually throwing a 1-month celebration party right there in the living room I had meticulously designed. Marcus had wasted absolutely no time. Less than 24 hours after sending his cowardly divorce email, he had transformed my personal sanctuary into a circus for his mistress. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it all was almost a work of art. He was spending money he thought he had access to, celebrating a victory he had not actually won, in a house he did not legally own. I adjusted the lapels of my custom-tailored emerald green suit, feeling the cool silk lining against my skin. I did not rush. I walked up the grand front steps, slowly letting my heels click rhythmically against the stone. Each step was a measured countdown to their complete and utter destruction. Before my hand even reached the heavy oak front door, it swung wide open. Standing there blocking the entrance while holding a craft beer and wearing a smug, insufferable grin was Brad. Brad was Tara's husband, making him my white brother-in-law. He was the kind of man who loved marrying into a wealthy black family because he thought it gave him a free pass to use our cultural slang, but he constantly reeked of unearned entitlement and endless microaggressions. He lived in a house that Marcus had helped them finance using my money. He drove a car he could not afford, and he carried himself like he was the mastermind behind all of our financial success. I had watched Brad for years. I had watched him eat the food paid for by my corporate acquisitions, drink the wine I imported from France, and sit at my dining table offering unsolicited business advice while his own startup ventures collapsed one after another. He survived purely on the financial fumes of my success, funneled to him secretly through Marcus. Yet here he was acting as the bouncer to my own kingdom. "Well, look who decided to crash the party," Brad said, leaning his tall, lanky frame against the doorframe to deliberately block my path. His smirk was a masterclass in unearned confidence. He stood with his legs planted wide, occupying as much physical space as possible, a classic intimidation tactic used by men who lack actual authority. He took a slow sip of his beer, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated condescension. "Marcus told us you might try something like this." Brad continued, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "He warned everyone you would probably fly back in a rage, ready to tear the place apart. Come on, Nia, let us not do the whole angry black woman routine today. It is a really bad look. You lost." Marcus moved on and found a woman who actually wants to be a mother. Just be classy, take your designer bags and make room for Chloe, all right? Do not make this harder than it has to be. There it was. The racial stereotyping was so predictable, it was almost boring. He weaponized the angry black woman trope, hoping to paralyze me with the fear of being perceived as an aggressive stereotype. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to lose my composure, to throw a tantrum on the front porch so he could play the rational peacemaker. He wanted to look back at the party guests inside and shake his head, validating Marcus's false narrative that I was a hostile, uncontrollable nightmare of a wife. But I do not perform for audiences, and I certainly do not perform for mediocre white men who survive on the financial scraps of my hard work. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I looked at his scuffed loafers, then slowly let my gaze travel up his wrinkled polo shirt, past his unimpressive jawline, until I locked eyes with him. I let a terrifying, absolute silence stretch between us for 5 agonizing seconds. I watched the arrogant smirk melt right off his face, replaced by a sudden creeping realization that he had drastically miscalculated the situation. I simply looked up at him with the kind of cold, deadpan stare that routinely made grown men in corporate boardrooms sweat through their expensive dress shirts. Brad. I said, my tone as smooth and cold as glass. The only thing standing between you and a criminal trespassing charge right now is my exceptionally good mood. Move. He hesitated, his arrogant smile faltering entirely under my unyielding gaze. He shifted his weight, clearly trying to decide if he had the spine to actually physically block me from entering my own home. You really do not want to do this, Nia, he muttered, though his voice completely lacked the bravado from just a moment ago. We have security here, we have guests. You are embarrassing yourself. You are... I did not wait for him to step aside. I stepped forward, my shoulder deliberately and forcefully clipping his chest, forcing him to stumble backward to maintain his balance. He spilled a few drops of his beer onto his generic shirt, muttering a curse under his breath. I did not look back. I smoothed my jacket, keeping my eyes fixed dead ahead, and walked right past him into my own grand foyer. The air conditioning washed over me, carrying the scent of expensive catered food and the cheap floral perfume Beatrice always wore. I stood for a brief moment in the entryway, taking in the full scope of the disrespect playing out in front of me. The chatter in the grand living room was deafening. Jazz music played loudly from the surround sound system I had personally installed last year. There were about 40 people gathered around the massive marble kitchen island. I recognized Marcus's college fraternity brothers, several gossiping women from Beatrice's social circle, and extended family members who had always treated me with thinly veiled contempt. Beatrice, my insufferable mother-in-law, was holding court near the catered appetizers. She was wearing a ridiculous floral dress that looked like it belonged on a cheap couch from the 1980s, laughing loudly and accepting congratulations from her shallow friends. Chloe, the 24-year-old mistress, turned baby mama, was sitting proudly on my custom Italian leather sofa. She was cradling her newborn for all the guests to admire, acting exactly like the lady of the manor. And Marcus, wearing the limited edition designer watch I bought him for his 30th birthday, stood near the fireplace. He was holding a crystal glass of champagne, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual owner of the house had just walked through the front door. The grand foyer was lined with the contemporary African-American art I had curated over a decade. Pieces that Marcus had always claimed were too aggressive for a suburban home. It was incredibly fitting that I was about to unleash a masterpiece of aggression right here in the center of it all. I took one deep breath, letting the anger crystallize into pure, unadulterated focus. It was time to introduce myself to the guests. I walked straight into the center of the grand living room. My heels struck the imported marble floors with the steady, unavoidable rhythm of a ticking clock. A caterer carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes froze in his tracks, his eyes widening. Somebody standing near the custom stereo system scrambled to hit the mute button. The smooth jazz abruptly cut off, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in its wake. 40 pairs of eyes turned to face me simultaneously. The atmosphere shifted from a joyous celebration to a crime scene in a matter of seconds. I let my gaze sweep across the room, making deliberate eye contact with the people who had gladly accepted an invitation to celebrate my husband's infidelity in my own home. Marcus's college fraternity brothers awkwardly set their drinks down on the side tables and began shuffling toward the hallway. Several gossiping women from Beatrice's elite social circle suddenly found the floor tile incredibly fascinating. They all knew exactly who I was, and they knew they had been caught trespassing on the wrong side of a war. Marcus stood near the fireplace, frozen in place. He set his crystal glass down so hard the stem nearly snapped under the pressure. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, ashen tone. Nia Marcus barked, his voice cracking slightly as he marched toward me. He puffed out his chest, trying to project dominance in front of his family and his shiny new mistress. "I told you not to come here. My lawyer sent you the notice. The locks were supposed to be changed." "They were changed," I replied calmly, not raising my voice a single decibel. "It took my security team exactly 12 minutes to bypass the cheap deadbolts you installed and hand me the new master keys at the airport." "You really should stop buying things on a budget, Marcus. It shows." Before he could formulate a response, Beatrice marched forward. Her face was twisted in a nasty scowl, her cheap floral dress rustling as she stepped into my personal space. "How dare you barge in here and disrespect my son?" Beatrice yelled, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You have no shame. Marcus is building a real family now, a family with a legacy. You need to pack whatever rags you left upstairs and leave this property immediately. Do not make us call the police to have you escorted out like a common criminal." I turned my gaze to Beatrice, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm. I looked at her pointing finger, then back up to her eyes, maintaining a cold, unyielding stare. Then I walked past Marcus, ignoring his presence entirely, and approached the massive marble kitchen island. I unclasped my designer handbag. I reached inside and pulled out a single thick manila folder. I dropped the folder right onto the center of the marble island with a heavy thud. "Let us talk about legacy, Beatrice," I said, my voice ringing out clearly across the dead silent room. "Marcus seems to be under the impression that because we are married, he is entitled to half of this estate. I assume that is why he thought he could move his glorified intern into my home, change my locks, and throw a party with my catered food." Marcus crossed his arms defensively, trying to regain the upper hand. "It is marital property, Nia. The law is the law. You made the money, but we built this life together. My lawyer assured me I have exclusive occupancy while the divorce is pending. You cannot just waltz in here and demand we leave." I laughed softly. It was a genuine melodic laugh that echoed off the high ceilings and made Chloe shrink back into the custom Italian leather sofa, clutching her baby tightly against her chest. "Your lawyer is an absolute idiot, Marcus," I said, tapping my manicured nails against the manila folder. "And clearly neither of you know how to read a property deed. You see, when we bought this $3 million house, I did not put it in my name. I certainly did not put it in your name. I purchased this entire estate through a blind holding company called Apex Holdings." I paced slowly around the kitchen island, forcing Marcus to turn and follow my movements. "I formed Apex Holdings exactly 2 years before I even met you. It is a corporate asset entirely and wholly owned by my firm. This house is not a marital asset. It is private corporate property. Your name is nowhere on the deed, nowhere on the mortgage, and nowhere on the tax records. You do not own the walls, you do not own the floors, and you certainly do not own the right to invite your mistress to sleep in my bed." The entire room gasped in unison. Beatrice clutched her chest as if she was experiencing a physical blow. Brad, who had followed me into the room, stood frozen by the doorway, his mouth hanging open. Marcus scrambled to the table and ripped open the manila folder. He pulled out the property records, his eyes darting frantically across the highlighted legal jargon. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He flipped to the second page, then the third. The realization hit him like a freight train. He was standing in a house he had absolutely no legal right to claim. He had brought his new family into a fortress that belonged entirely to his soon-to-be ex-wife. "You cannot do this," Marcus stammered, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. His hands shook as the papers rattled in his grip. "We are married. You cannot just kick me out." "I already did," I replied smoothly. "You filed for divorce, Marcus. You sent the email. You drew the battle lines. I am just bringing the artillery." I checked the diamond watch on my wrist, letting the second hand tick past before I looked back up at him. "It is currently 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I have my private security detail waiting at the end of the street. You, your mother, your sister, your racist brother-in-law, and your little intern Have exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever cheap belongings you brought into my corporate property. At 2:30, anyone still standing inside this house will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Chloe burst into tears. The facade of the triumphant new mother vanished instantly. "Marcus, do something," she wailed, her voice cracking with terror. "Where are we going to go? We have a baby!" Marcus turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and absolute terror. "Nia, please! You cannot put my child out on the street. Be reasonable. Let us talk to the lawyers. Let us work something out. We need time to find a place." I stepped right up to him, closing the distance until we were inches apart. I looked deep into his eyes, watching his massive ego shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "You should have thought about your child before you decided to play corporate tycoon with my money," I whispered softly, making sure only he could hear the venom in my voice. "Now get your trash out of my house!" Beatrice shrieked, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. She was frantic, punching in numbers with zero coordination. "I am calling my lawyers. I am calling the bank right now. We will sue you for everything you are worth. You cannot leave my son destitute. We will drain the joint accounts and fight you in court until you have nothing left." I smiled at the older woman, savoring the pure, unadulterated desperation in her voice. It was the sweetest music I had heard all day. "You can certainly try Beatrice," I said casually as I turned to walk toward the front door, "but you might want to ask Marcus why his credit cards were declining at the caterer this morning. I froze the joint accounts 3 days ago. The only thing left in there is exactly enough to cover the monthly payment on his leased sedan. Everything else has been legally reallocated." I paused at the threshold, looking back at the horrified faces of the family who had spent 7 years trying to tear me down, trying to make me feel small, trying to minimize my hard work to protect a fragile man's pride. Now they were scrambling like rats on a sinking ship. "Your 30 minutes starts now," I announced clearly. I stepped out onto the front porch and let the heavy oak door click shut behind me. The afternoon sun felt glorious on my skin. I took a deep breath of the Georgia air, smiling to myself as the sounds of frantic shouting, breaking glass, and loud sobbing erupted from inside the house. Marcus thought he was a king, but he forgot the most important rule of the board. You never try to dethrone a queen when she owns the entire kingdom. And the best part was, I had not even dropped the real bomb on them yet. The financial hellfire was just getting started. 2 weeks later, the air inside the downtown Atlanta mediation office was sterile and suffocating. The glass-walled conference room was designed to project transparency, but everyone sitting at the heavy mahogany table was playing a game of shadows. I sat perfectly still, my posture impeccable, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded the space without me having to utter a single syllable. Across from me sat Marcus. He was sweating. It was barely noticeable, just a slight sheen on his forehead and the nervous tapping of his expensive leather shoe against the carpet, but I saw it. I always saw everything. Beside him sat his overpriced legal counsel, a slick man named Sterling who wore too much cologne and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who assumed I was just another emotional wife going through a messy divorce. I looked at Marcus from over the shoulder of my own attorney, remaining completely silent as Sterling pulled a thick stack of documents from his Italian leather briefcase and slid them across the polished wood surface. "My client is prepared to be reasonable today." Nia, Sterling began, leaning forward and steepling his fingers in a patronizing gesture. "We want to avoid a protracted public legal battle that could damage the reputation of your firm. Given the lack of a prenuptial agreement when you two married 7 years ago, Georgia law dictates an equitable division of all marital assets. We have had independent financial analysts review your corporate crisis management and M&A firm. They value the enterprise at approximately $20 million. Sterling paused, letting that massive number hang in the quiet room, waiting for me to react. I did not blink. I did not shift in my chair. I simply stared at Marcus, watching him swallow hard and try to puff out his chest. Therefore, Sterling continued, his voice dripping with artificial magnanimity. "Marcus is legally entitled to $10 million for his half of the business. Additionally, considering the lifestyle he has grown accustomed to during your marriage, we are requesting a lump sum of $2 million in spousal support to be paid out within 30 days of the finalized decree." If you sign this settlement today, Marcus is willing to waive any further claims against your future earnings. We think this is a highly generous offer. I let a heavy, terrifying silence blanket the room. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a judge striking a gavel. I slowly reached out with my manicured hand and pulled the settlement document toward me. I did not open it. I merely rested my fingertips on the crisp white paper. Generous. I repeated my voice, a soft, dangerous murmur. You are demanding $12 million of the empire I built with my own blood, sweat, and intellect, and you are calling it generous. Marcus could not handle the silence anymore. His fragile ego, battered by the eviction 2 weeks prior, demanded to be heard. He slammed his hand flat on the table, trying to mimic the authority I naturally possessed. I earned that money. Nia Marcus snapped, his voice rising in pitch. I sacrificed my own peace of mind, dealing with a woman who cared more about corporate boardrooms than her own husband. You worked 80-hour weeks. You were never home. You completely neglected your duties as a wife. I stood by you while you built that company. I entertained your clients. I played the supportive spouse while you emasculated me at every turn. I deserve half of everything you have. I looked at him with absolute pity. Entertained my clients, I asked smoothly. You mean you drank their top-shelf scotch on my corporate tab and embarrassingly tried to pitch them your amateur real estate portfolios? You did not build my company, Marcus. You were just a highly expensive decorative accessory that I occasionally brought to charity galas. Marcus's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The truth always infuriated him. He leaned aggressively across the table, abandoning all pretense of legal decorum. He wanted to hurt me. He needed to strike at the deepest insecurities he assumed I harbored as a woman. You want to talk about being an accessory? Marcus sneered, his eyes narrowing with pure malice. You were a barren workaholic, Nia. That is the truth. You were so obsessed with making money and proving you were better than everyone else that you failed at the one basic biological function of being a woman. You could not give me a family. You could not give me a legacy. I am a man who needs a true heir to carry on my name. Chloe gave me a son. She gave me the family you were too broken and too obsessed with money to provide. My son deserves the lifestyle we built, and I'm going to make sure my true heir is provided for using the money you owe me. Sterling held up a hand, trying to rein his client in, realizing that Marcus was dangerously close to unhinging the professional atmosphere of the mediation. Marcus, that is enough. Let us stick to the financial parameters of the settlement. But Marcus was too far gone. He felt emboldened high on the delusion that the law was an impenetrable shield protecting his greed. He looked at me with a sickening, triumphant smirk, convinced that calling me a barren failure had finally struck a fatal blow to my armor. He thought weaponizing his new baby and his mistress would break my spirit right there in the conference room. He believed that the societal pressure on Black women to be mothers, to be nurturing caretakers, was a vulnerability he could exploit to empty my bank accounts. You thought your money made you invincible, Marcus mocked, leaning back in his chair with a heavy exhale. But you are just alone, Nia. You are rich, and you are entirely alone. Sign the paper. Give me what I am owed so I can go raise my family and you can go back to your empty, sterile life. My lawyer shifted beside me, preparing to intervene and shut down the personal attacks, but I raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. I did not need a man in a suit to defend my honor. I had brought Marcus to this room specifically to let him dig his own grave, and he had just happily shoveled the last pile of dirt. I looked at Marcus, absorbing the sheer pathetic reality of the man I had once promised to love. He was begging for millions of dollars to raise a child with his former intern, using the legal system to extort a woman he had systematically betrayed. He wanted half of my $20 million firm. He wanted my sweat equity to fund his illusion of suburban bliss. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the pain he so desperately wanted to see. Instead, a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that made opposing corporate raiders instantly reconsider their negotiating positions. You are right about one thing, Marcus, I said, my voice ringing with crystal clear authority. You do have a new family to feed, and babies are incredibly expensive. It takes a remarkable amount of capital to raise a child, especially when you are accustomed to living a life of luxury funded entirely by your wife. Sterling leaned forward, sensing a victory. Then we are in agreement that a $12 million settlement is a fair and equitable dissolution of the marital assets, he asked smoothly, sliding a gold pen across the mahogany table toward me. Just sign on the dotted line, Nia, and we can all walk away from this cleanly. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the extortion paperwork demanding half of my life's work. Then I looked dead into Marcus's eyes, watching the greedy anticipation radiating from his pupils. He was already spending my millions in his head. He was already picking out the private schools for his so-called true heir. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought the absence of a prenuptial agreement was his golden ticket to generational wealth. I picked up the pen. I held it between my fingers, feeling the heavy metal casing. Marcus let out a slow breath of relief, a victorious smirk cementing itself on his face. He actually thought I was going to surrender. He actually thought he had won the war. But I did not sign the paper. Instead, I calmly tossed the gold pen back across the table. It clattered sharply against the wood, stopping right in front of Sterling's expensive briefcase. I am not signing anything, I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal hushed register, because you cannot demand half of something that does not exist. Marcus frowned, his smirk faltering as confusion washed over his features. What are you talking about? He demanded. Your firm is worth $20 million. My analysts verified the corporate accounts. The revenue is public record. You cannot hide an entire company, Nia. The law does not work that way. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance across the table, locking Marcus in a gaze so piercing it practically pinned him to his chair. I was about to teach my soon-to-be ex-husband a masterclass in corporate warfare. I was about to show him exactly why I was the chief executive officer of a crisis management firm and why he was nothing more than a middle management pawn playing a game he did not even begin to understand. My attorney, who had remained perfectly silent for the entire duration of the meeting, finally moved. He did not speak. He did not pull out a single loose sheet of paper. Instead, he reached into his sleek leather briefcase and extracted a thick, professionally bound corporate prospectus stamped with gold foil. He slid it gently across the mahogany table. It glided with a soft, expensive whisper and stopped right on top of Sterling's ridiculous settlement demand. I kept my gaze locked on Marcus. The camera in my mind executed a slow, deliberate push in on his face, capturing the exact moment his arrogant certainty began to curdle into sheer panic. He looked down at the heavy document, then back up at my cold, calculating eyes. You are entirely correct about one detail, Sterling, I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of any emotional inflection. My crisis management firm was valued at exactly $20 million. Past tense. Was. Marcus scoffed, though the sound was shaky and thin. What do you mean, was? You walked into your office yesterday. You are the chief executive officer. You cannot just vanish a $20 million company overnight, Nia. The courts will see right through whatever cheap accounting trick you are trying to pull. Not overnight, Marcus. I corrected him, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms with absolute authority. It took exactly 8 months. I watched his throat swallow hard. I saw the gears turning in his head as the timeline clicked into place. 8 months ago, I noticed a very interesting, highly irregular withdrawal from our joint checking account. I continued enunciating every single syllable so he could not escape the weight of his own stupidity. You labeled it as a business consulting expense, but I do not do anything halfway. I hired an elite private investigator. Within 48 hours, I had the high-resolution photos of you and Chloe entering the St. Regis Hotel. I had the receipts for the diamond tennis bracelet you bought her for her birthday, and I had the medical clinic confirmation of her pregnancy. You were sloppy, Marcus. You were careless and arrogant, and you left a paper trail a mile wide. Marcus froze completely. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Sterling sat up poker straight, his professional detachment suddenly evaporating as he realized he was sitting next to a massive liability. When I read that investigator's file, I gave myself one single night to mourn the death of my marriage, I said, leaning forward again, dropping my voice to a lethal register. The very next morning, I went into my office and initiated a hostile takeover of my own company. I gestured gracefully toward the bound prospectus sitting in front of them. I reached out to a massive corporate conglomerate based in London. We negotiated a highly confidential, incredibly lucrative acquisition. My domestic limited liability company, the exact marital asset you are currently trying to sink your greedy claws into, was formally dissolved. It was entirely absorbed by the British parent company. Sterling grabbed the prospectus, flipping frantically through the executive summary. His eyes darted back and forth across the pages, absorbing the legal structuring, the dates, the international corporate seals, and the board signatures. He was looking for a loophole, a crack in the armor, a mistake he could exploit in a Georgia family court. He was not going to find one. I do not make mistakes. As part of the acquisition terms, my equity buyout was not paid to me in domestic cash, I explained, watching the blood completely drain from Marcus's face. My payout was converted into shares and deposited directly into an irrevocable offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. A trust governed exclusively by international corporate law, completely isolated and insulated from United States domestic family court jurisdiction. I let out a soft, mocking sigh. I do not own the money, Marcus. The trust owns the money. I am merely a compensated employee of the London conglomerate now. And the offshore trust owes you absolutely nothing. Sterling dropped the prospectus onto the table like it was on fire. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of deep professional embarrassment and sheer pity. The lawyer knew his percentage of the settlement had just vanished into thin air. He knew he had been completely outplayed by a woman who treated corporate law like a symphony. "She is telling the truth," Marcus Sterling whispered to his client, rubbing his forehead in defeat. "The domestic entity is gone. It was liquidated, taxed, and absorbed months before you even filed the divorce papers. The marital asset you are asking for does not legally exist anymore. We cannot touch that offshore trust. It is impenetrable." Marcus jumped to his feet, his heavy chair scraping violently against the carpet. He slammed both his fists onto the mahogany table, looming over it with wild, erratic energy. "That is fraud!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. "You hid marital assets. I will have a judge tear that trust apart. I will hire forensic accountants to rip your life to shreds. You cannot do this to me, Nia. I am your husband. I am entitled to half of what you built." "You were my husband when it was convenient for you," I stated coldly, not flinching at his outburst. "And it is not fraud, Marcus. It is a perfectly legal, fully taxed, board-approved international corporate merger. I simply secured my company's global expansion. The fact that it completely insulated my life's work from your filthy, cheating hands was just a delightful, highly anticipated bonus." He stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a terror he had never experienced in his entire privileged, mediocre life. He had walked into this room expecting to leave with $12 million. He had walked in expecting to fund his new life, his new mistress, and his true heir using the empire I built. "You sat across the dinner table from me for 8 months, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling with the realization of my absolute ruthlessness. "You smiled at me. You asked about my day. You slept in our bed while you were secretly dismantling my entire future." "I built your future, Marcus," I snapped back, my voice cracking like a whip across the room. "I gave you the house, the cars, the lifestyle, and the unearned arrogance you strut around with. And because you could not handle the fact that a black woman provided everything you had, you tried to betray me and steal my crown." I stood up slowly, buttoning my tailored jacket. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but cold, clinical detachment. "You wanted $12 million to go play house with your intern," I said, "but you brought a butter knife to a nuclear war. You are walking out of this marriage with the exact same thing you brought into it. Absolutely nothing." Marcus was shaking. His pride was entirely eviscerated, but his toxic ego refused to let him surrender. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. You think you are so smart? He snarled, his voice echoing in the glass room. You think hiding your money means you won. I will drain every single cent from my own accounts to fight you. I will hire a team of lawyers to drag this out for years. I will bleed you dry with legal fees. I am a senior director at one of the biggest investment funds in Atlanta. I have my own money, Nia. I do not need your offshore trust to destroy you. I paused. I did not sit back down. I simply remained standing, looking at him with a predatory, chilling smile. He had just handed me the perfect transition. He had just walked blindly into the second trap. Your own money, I repeated softly, tasting the absolute irony of his threat. That is fascinating, Marcus. Let us talk about your own money. I reached slowly back into my tailored briefcase. The camera in my mind executed a sharp, violent whip pan directly from my steady hand to Marcus's face. The remaining color instantly drained from his cheeks. His skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He knew that tone of voice. After 7 years of marriage, he knew exactly what I sounded like when I was no longer negotiating but executing. I pulled out a second folder. It was a slim, bright red folder this time. I placed it on the mahogany table and slid it gracefully across the polished surface. It glided with a soft swish and stopped precisely next to the golden pen he had tried to force me to use just minutes prior. You see, Marcus, I began keeping my posture perfectly relaxed when I hired that private investigator to track your little romantic weekend getaways. I did not just ask for hotel receipts and restaurant bills. I am a mergers and acquisitions specialist. I analyze capital for a living. I follow the money. And your money. Marcus was telling a fascinating, wildly reckless story. Marcus stared at the red folder like it was a live, explosive device ticking down to zero. He did not want to touch it. He pulled his hands back and gripped the armrests of his chair. Sterling, his highly paid, overly confident lawyer, did not share his hesitation. Sterling reached out, flipped open the cover of the red folder, and began to read. You make a very comfortable salary as a senior director at the investment fund. I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the silent glass-walled room. But a senior director's salary does not cover a brand-new, fully loaded Mercedes-Benz AMG for a 24-year-old intern. It certainly does not cover the $200,000 seed capital you miraculously gifted your white brother-in-law Brad for his pathetic doomed tech startup last quarter. Marcus swallowed so hard his Adam's apple bobbed sharply against his collar. I made good investments, he stammered, his voice lacking any of its previous booming authority. I had quarterly bonuses, Nia. I manage high-yield portfolios. I let out a short, sharp laugh that cut through his lie instantly. You had access, Marcus. That is what you had. You had unrestricted access to the secondary tier holding accounts at your investment fund. The accounts used for minor operational liquidities. You thought nobody monitored them closely because the primary portfolios were moving billions of dollars every day. You thought you were the smartest man in the room. I watched Sterling's eyes dart frantically across the pages inside the red folder. The lawyer was looking at bank routing numbers, offshore wire transfer logs, and falsified corporate invoice approvals. Marcus had been setting up dummy vendor accounts and funneling his employer's money right into his personal checking account. He had been stealing from the very firm that gave him his title, using their capital to play sugar daddy to a naive intern and venture capitalist to a racist freeloading brother-in-law who constantly undermined my success. That is textbook embezzlement, Marcus, I stated, enunciating the criminal charge so clearly it hung in the air like a guillotine blade. It is wire fraud. It is falsifying corporate financial records. I had a forensic accountant compile this beautiful, undeniable dossier. Every single dime you spent trying to build your new life, every extravagant gift you bought Chloe, and every dollar you handed to Brad was stolen directly from your employer. Sterling practically shoved his chair backward, the legs screeching against the carpet. He physically distanced himself from Marcus in a matter of seconds. The slick, arrogant lawyer who had just demanded $12 million from me suddenly realized he was sitting next to a massive radioactive criminal liability. Sterling knew this was no longer a standard family court dispute over marital assets. This was federal prison territory, and lawyers like Sterling do not suborn perjury or willingly participate in massive financial fraud cases. "You hacked my accounts!" Marcus yelled, though his voice was entirely stripped of its power. He was grasping at invisible straws, his eyes wild with panic. "This is illegally obtained information. It is inadmissible in court. A judge will throw this out, Nia." "It is an anonymous tip waiting to be sent to the Securities and Exchange Commission," I countered smoothly, resting my elbows on the table and lacing my fingers together. "Or better yet, it is a highly detailed package waiting to be couriered directly to the Chief Executive Officer of your investment fund. I wonder how your boss will react to this audit." The threat landed exactly where I intended. The fight completely drained out of Marcus. His shoulders slumped forward, and the arrogant, chest-puffing man who had just insulted my womanhood withered into a terrified, broken shell. He looked at the red folder, then at his lawyer who was hastily packing his Italian leather briefcase, entirely abandoning the sinking ship. "Nia, please." Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "They will ruin me. They will press charges and seize everything I have. I will go to federal prison. You cannot do this to me. I am the father of a newborn baby. Chloe and I will have nothing." "You threatened to bleed me dry with legal fees," I reminded him, my voice devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "You threatened to use your money to destroy the empire I built with my own hands. You called me a barren failure and demanded my wealth to raise your true heir. But you do not have any money, Marcus. You have stolen funds and a ticking clock." I stood up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal suit and looked down at the man who had tried to bury me. I was the architect of his reality now. "Here is how this mediation ends," I announced, projecting absolute unwavering authority. "You are going to sign a complete and total waiver of alimony. You are going to formally relinquish any and all claims to my business, my properties, and my personal assets. You are going to accept a divorce settlement of exactly $0 and 0 cents. Marcus stared up at me, tears of pure humiliation pooling in his eyes. "But I will have nothing," he whispered, his voice shaking. "How am I supposed to support my family?" "That sounds like a problem for a senior director to solve," I replied coldly. "If your lawyer files one single motion against my assets, if you so much as breathe the word alimony in a courtroom, or if you ever try to contact me again, this red folder lands on your boss's desk by tomorrow morning. You can choose to walk away with nothing, or you can choose to walk away in handcuffs. I really do not care which one you pick." I did not wait for his answer. I picked up my briefcase, turned on my heel, and walked toward the glass doors of the conference room. I could hear Marcus sobbing behind me, a pathetic broken sound that echoed in the sterile office. He was entirely trapped in a cage of his own making, suffocating under the weight of his own greed and insecurity. I pushed the glass doors open and stepped out into the hallway, leaving my soon-to-be ex-husband alone with his ruined reputation and his stolen money. The second phase of my plan was officially complete, but the war was far from over. I had dismantled his financial leverage, but I still needed to expose the rotting foundation of the family that had enabled his arrogance for years. It was time to deal with Beatrice, Brad, and Tara. They thought they could ride Marcus's coattails to high society, living off my wealth while treating me like an outsider. They were about to learn that when you bite the hand that feeds you, you eventually starve. My corner office on the 42nd floor of the Apex building was designed to intimidate. It featured stark white walls, black leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The air was always kept at a crisp 68 degrees. It was a space built for calculated decisions and ruthless execution. It was not a space built for hysterical, uninvited guests. The heavy mahogany door flew open with such force it slammed against the doorstop, the sound echoing sharply across the polished hardwood floor. My assistant, a fiercely competent woman named Maya, was 2 steps behind the intruder, her hand hovering near the silent alarm button on her tablet. "I am so sorry, Ms. Washington," Maya said, her voice steady but laced with tension. She pushed past security in the lobby. I have already called them up. It is fine, Maya, I replied, not looking up from the quarterly report I was reviewing. You can cancel security. I will handle this. I waited until Maya closed the door, the heavy click sealing the room in absolute silence. Only then did I raise my eyes to meet the furious, erratic gaze of my former mother-in-law, Beatrice Washington. Beatrice looked like she had just survived a hurricane in a Chanel boutique. Her usually flawless, stiffly sprayed hair was slightly askew. Her designer silk blouse, the one she loved to brag she had purchased in Paris, looked wrinkled. The most shocking detail, however, was her posture. Beatrice had always carried herself with an artificially rigid spine projecting an air of old money superiority. Now she was trembling, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath, clutching her oversized crocodile skin handbag like a life preserver. "You malicious ghetto-born terror!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking as she marched toward my desk. The camera in my mind shifted to a handheld style capturing the frantic, unhinged energy vibrating from her every movement. "How dare you? How dare you humiliate my son and throw my family out into the street like common trash?" I did not flinch. I slowly closed the quarterly report, aligned the edges perfectly with the corner of my desk, and folded my hands together. "I did not throw you into the street, Beatrice," I corrected her calmly, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by another 10 degrees. "I evicted you from my corporate property. The fact that your son decided to move his mistress and his illegitimate child into a house he did not own is not my problem. It is a spectacular failure of the elite upbringing you are always so eager to remind me about." Beatrice slammed her hand down on the edge of my desk, her perfectly manicured nails clicking sharply against the glass surface. She leaned forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure classist hatred. "Do not you dare speak to me about upbringing," she spat, her eyes wide and wild. "You think because you wear expensive suits and sit in this glass tower that you are one of us. You are nothing but a hustler from a working-class neighborhood who got lucky. You climbed up on my son's back to get into Atlanta high society. You needed the Washington name to legitimize yourself. My son is royalty in this city, and you are just a temporary, embarrassing mistake he made when he was trying to be rebellious." I watched her unravel, fascinated by the sheer delusion required to maintain her worldview. Beatrice had spent her entire adult life curating an image of generational wealth and untouchable social standing. She hosted charity galas, sat on the boards of local museums, and judged anyone who did not have a pedigree stretching back to the civil rights movement. She had relentlessly mocked my background, reminding me at every Thanksgiving dinner that my parents were blue-collar workers who did not understand the nuances of fine dining or country club politics. "You really believe that, do you not, Beatrice?" I asked softly, tilting my head. "You actually believe that Marcus, a middle management fund director who leases his cars and finances his watches on credit, is the crown jewel of Atlanta? You actually think I needed your irrelevant, decaying family name to build a $20 million empire?" Beatrice recoiled as if I had struck her. She clutched her pearl necklace, her breathing growing more ragged. "I am going to destroy you, Nia!" she threatened, her voice shaking with a desperate, terrifying fury. "You think you won because you hid your money and kicked Marcus out of that house. You do not understand how this city works. I know everyone who matters. I sit on the board of every major charity in Buckhead. I will make sure you are blacklisted from every gala, every country club, and every social event in Atlanta. I will tell all my friends about the psychotic, vindictive woman you truly are. I will make sure your business suffers. I will make sure your name is mud. I will ruin your reputation so thoroughly you will have to crawl back to whatever low-income neighborhood you came from." She paused, gasping for air, her eyes burning with the absolute conviction that her social influence could somehow dismantle my corporate power. She was clinging to the only weapon she thought she had left, her social standing. She actually believed that getting me uninvited from a few pretentious charity dinners would somehow break my spirit and send me running back to Marcus with open checkbooks. I let her threat hang in the cold, sterile air of my office. I did not interrupt her. I did not defend my reputation or argue about my social standing. I simply sat there observing her frantic, disorganized energy, waiting for her to completely exhaust her pathetic arsenal. When she finally stopped talking, when the only sound in the room was her ragged breathing and the faint hum of the air conditioning, I reached into the top drawer of my desk. I did not pull out a legal document or a bank statement. I pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. I set it gently on the glass surface between us. "You want to talk about reputations, Beatrice?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying the lethal weight of absolute certainty. "Let us talk about reputations. Let us talk about the pristine, untouchable Washington legacy you are so desperate to protect." Beatrice stared at the small black device. The color began to drain from her face exactly as it had drained from Marcus's face in the mediation room. She recognized the tone of my voice. She recognized that she had just walked blindly into a trap and the jaws were about to snap shut. "What is that?" she demanded, though her voice lacked any of the venom from just a moment ago. "What are you playing at, Nia?" "I am not playing Beatrice," I stated coldly, leaning back in my chair. "I am finishing the game you and your son started." I leaned back into the plush leather of my executive chair. The camera in my mind slowly lowered, dropping down to the floor to shoot upward, capturing me from a position of absolute, unassailable power. I looked down at the woman who had spent 7 years treating me like an uninvited pest at her royal banquet. Beatrice stood frozen in front of my desk, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes locked onto the small black device sitting on the glass surface. I reached forward with a single manicured finger and pressed the silver play button. A brief hiss of static filled the sterile air of my office, followed immediately by a voice. It was Beatrice. But she did not sound like the arrogant high society matriarch who had just threatened to blacklist me from every country club in Atlanta. She sounded frantic, shrill, and utterly pathetic. "Marcus, you have to do something," the recorded voice of Beatrice wailed. "The bank just sent another notice of default. The pension fund is completely empty. You know it has been empty for years. If I miss one more mortgage payment on this house, they are going to initiate foreclosure. I cannot lose this house, Marcus. If the women on the charity board find out I am broke, I will be an absolute laughingstock. I will be ruined." A second voice joined the recording. It was Marcus, sounding exhausted and deeply agitated. "I am handling it, Mom. Stop panicking. I am transferring the funds from the secondary joint account right now. Nia never checks that account because she only uses it for automated corporate tax overflows. I will clear the mortgage payment and send you an extra $5,000 for your gala tickets. Just keep up appearances and do not say a word to anyone." "Oh, thank God," the recorded Beatrice sobbed. "You are such a good son, Marcus. I do not know what I would do without you." I reached forward and pressed the stop button. The crisp click echoed loudly in the room. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely magnificent. Beatrice was no longer looking at the recorder. She was staring blankly at the wall behind me, her jaw completely slack, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the sheer blood-draining horror consuming her face. The illusion she had spent decades cultivating had just been violently shattered. "You have a very expensive lifestyle, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice smooth and conversational, like I was discussing the weather. "Designer clothes, luxury vehicles, extravagant donations to buy your way onto elite charity boards. But maintaining the illusion of old money requires actual money. And your late husband's pension ran completely dry over 3 years ago." Beatrice tried to speak. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. She clutched her crocodile skin handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You see?" I continued, resting my hands on the armrests of my chair. Marcus desperately wanted to be the hero. He wanted to be the wealthy patriarch who took care of his aristocratic mother. But Marcus does not have patriarch money. He has middle management money. So to keep you dripping in pearls and sitting at the head tables of your precious galas, he started stealing from me. I stood up slowly, walking around my glass desk until I was standing only a few feet away from her. She physically shrank back, entirely stripped of the venom she had carried into my office just minutes prior. "For 3 years, Marcus siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from an old operational joint account I set up early in our marriage. It was an account I funded entirely with my corporate dividends. He used my money to pay your mortgage. He used my money to pay your country club dues. He used my money to buy that absurd Chanel blouse you are wearing right now. I took one step closer, looking down into her terrified eyes. You walked into my office today and called me a ghetto-born terror. You insulted my working-class parents. You threatened to use your elite social standing to ruin my reputation in Atlanta. But your entire social standing is a fraud, Beatrice. You are a broke, desperate woman living in a house that is currently 3 months behind on payments because I froze the very account your son was using to keep you afloat. Beatrice shook her head frantically. Tears began to spill over her eyelashes, ruining her expensive mascara. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. No, Marcus said he had investments. He said he was managing my portfolio. He lied to you to protect his fragile ego, I corrected her sharply. And you gladly looked the other way as long as the checks cleared. You built a throne out of my money and then had the audacity to look down your nose at me from it. I walked back around my desk and picked up the digital recorder, turning it over in my hand. I wonder what those women on the charity board would say if they heard this audio file, I mused aloud. I wonder how fast your elite friends would stop returning your phone calls if they found out the Grand Washington legacy is nothing but a mountain of hidden debt and unpaid bills. I wonder how quickly they would cancel your country club membership when the bank finally repossesses your house next month. Please. Beatrice begged the word, tearing out of her throat. The arrogant high society matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a terrified woman facing the absolute destruction of her entire identity. Nia, please. You cannot release that. It will destroy me. I will have nothing. I will be humiliated. You should have thought about humiliation before you tried to threaten my empire, I stated coldly. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on my desk, delivering the final fatal blow. The elite Washington legacy has been surviving on ghetto money, Beatrice. And as of today, the tap is completely permanently dry. The weight of those words hit her like a physical strike. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless sob. Her knees simply gave out beneath her. She collapsed entirely, dropping to the polished hardwood floor in a heap of wrinkled silk and shattered pride. Her expensive handbag spilled open, scattering lipsticks and credit cards across the ground. She covered her face with trembling hands, hyperventilating, as the reality of her impending bankruptcy and social exile crushed the air out of her lungs. She was going to lose her house. She was going to be evicted. She was going to be forced to move into a low-income apartment, shunned by every single person she had spent her life trying to impress. And she knew with absolute certainty that no one in her fake, pretentious social circle would ever throw her a life preserver. I looked down at the weeping woman on my office floor. I felt absolutely no pity. She had spent 7 years trying to make me feel small, trying to make me feel unworthy of the space I occupied. Now she was exactly where she belonged, groveling on the floor while I stood above her. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. Maya, I said smoothly. Yes, Ms. Washington, my assistant answered immediately. Beatrice is ready to leave now, I instructed. Please have building security escort her out through the service elevator. I do not want her causing a scene in the main lobby. And Maya, check the visitor log. Let me know when Brad and Tara arrive. They should be pulling into the parking garage any minute now. Understood, Ms. Washington. Security is on the way. I released the intercom button and stepped over Beatrice's scattered belongings, making my way toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The mother-in-law had been thoroughly dismantled. The husband was financially castrated, but the family tree still had a few rotting branches left that needed to be pruned. Brad and Tara were about to walk into the exact same slaughterhouse, and they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. The heavy mahogany door swung open for the second time that hour, and Maya did not even bother to announce them. She simply stepped aside, her face a mask of professional disdain, allowing Tara and Brad to enter my office. The camera in my mind immediately zoomed in on Brad. He walked in first, leading with the kind of performative, unearned confidence that only a mediocre white man married into a wealthy family could possess. He was wearing a pastel polo shirt and pressed khakis, looking entirely out of place in the sleek, high-stakes environment of my corporate headquarters. Tara trailed closely behind him, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. She had always been a professional victim, a woman who spent her entire life riding the coattails of her brother Marcus's fabricated success. She glared at me, her face pinched with the same arrogant entitlement that had just caused her mother to collapse on my floor 10 minutes prior. "Nia, we came because we want to de-escalate this situation." Brad began holding his hands up in a gesture of fake pacifying surrender. He used that soft, patronizing tone he always employed when he was trying to play the enlightened mediator. "We know tensions are running incredibly high right now. Marcus is devastated. Beatrice is inconsolable. We just think everyone needs to take a deep breath, step back, and find some grace before this family is permanently destroyed." I remained standing behind my glass desk. I did not invite them to sit. I looked at Brad, analyzing the sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy radiating from his pores. "De-escalate," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue like poison. "That is a fascinating choice of vocabulary, Brad, especially considering your recent social media activity." Brad shifted his weight, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "I do not know what you mean," he lied smoothly. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the glass desk. "I mean the incredibly lengthy, deeply emotional manifesto you posted on LinkedIn and Facebook yesterday morning. The one where you lamented the tragic loss of family values. The one where you explicitly stated that corporate greed and ruthless ambition are destroying the sanctity of the modern home. You did not use my name, Brad, but your entire network knew exactly who the blood-sucking aggressive homewrecker in your little narrative was supposed to be. You played the empathetic, heartbroken bystander perfectly online while actively villainizing me for refusing to be robbed blind by your brother-in-law." Tara stepped forward, her voice sharp and defensive. "You did destroy this family, Nia. You left Marcus with nothing. You kicked him out of his own house. You are acting like a complete sociopath over a mistake he made. He is trying to build a family and you are just trying to ruin us all out of pure spite." I shifted my gaze to Tara, feeling absolutely nothing for the woman standing in front of me. "I am not the one who ruined your family, Tara," I stated with glacial calm. "You brought the arsonist right into your own home, and you even bought the gasoline for him." I reached into the same drawer where I had kept the digital recorder for Beatrice. This time I pulled out a thick, glossy envelope. I tossed it onto the center of the desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "What is that?" Tara demanded, taking a cautious step forward. Brad did not move. The camera focus locked entirely on his face. The performative innocence, the patronizing mediator persona, all of it evaporated in an instant. His eyes darted to the envelope, his pupils dilating with a sudden primal panic. He knew exactly what kind of business I ran. He knew I never made a claim I could not back up with devastating, irrefutable proof. "Open it, Tara," I instructed, leaning forward and resting my palms on the glass. "Open it and see exactly what kind of man your enlightened, socially conscious husband really is." Tara looked at Brad, confused by the sheer terror suddenly gripping his features. She reached out and pulled the envelope toward her. She flipped open the flap and pulled out a stack of high-definition 8x10 photographs. The silence in my office shattered into a million pieces. Tara let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her hands began to tremble so violently the glossy photos rattled against each other. The images were crystal clear, captured by the elite private investigator I had hired to track Marcus. But these specific photos were not of Marcus. They were photos of Brad. In the first photo, Brad was pinned against the wall of a dimly lit hotel hallway, his hands tangled in the blonde hair of a young, familiar woman. They were kissing passionately, deeply entangled. In the second photo, they were walking out of a boutique motel room, Brad buttoning his shirt while the woman adjusted her skirt. In the third photo, they were sitting at an upscale bar laughing intimately over cocktails. The woman in every single photograph was Chloe, the very same 24-year-old mistress who had just given birth to Marcus's so-called heir. "No," Tara whispered, her voice completely hollowed out by shock. She looked up at Brad, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. No, Brad. Tell me this is fake. Tell me she doctored these. Brad was suffocating. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless stammer came out. Tara, baby, please, he begged, holding his hands up defensively, stepping backward toward the heavy mahogany door. I can explain. It is not what it looks like. It was a long time ago. I did not let him spin his web of lies. I stepped out from behind my desk, taking complete control of the execution. Look at the timestamp in the bottom right corner of those photographs. Tara, I commanded, my voice ringing out like a judge delivering a death sentence. Those photos were taken 14 months ago. That is exactly 6 months before Marcus even interviewed Chloe for the internship at his investment fund. Tara looked down at the bright red digital timestamp on the photos. Her breath hitched. The timeline clicked into place in her mind, locking the final piece of the puzzle into a devastating picture. Your husband did not just sleep with the mistress, Tara. I continued, my words striking like physical blows. He found her first. Brad met Chloe at a bar downtown. He slept with her for months behind your back. But Brad is a freeloader. He does not have the money to keep a young, ambitious girl entertained. His pathetic tech startup was failing, and he could not afford the designer bags or the boutique hotel room she demanded. I walked closer to them, watching Brad shrink against the wall. So your brilliant husband came up with a solution, I explained, looking directly at Tara's tear-streaked, furious face. He manipulated Marcus. He brought Chloe to a networking event and intentionally introduced her to your brother. He planted the seed. Brad knew Marcus had a fragile ego and a wandering eye. He knew Marcus had access to millions of dollars. Brad effectively passed his mistress off to your brother, knowing Marcus would foot the bill and keep her exactly where Brad could still access her. Brad shook his head violently, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. Shut up, he screamed at me. Shut your mouth, Nia, you are lying. Tara, she is trying to destroy us. She is a vindictive, lying witch. Tara did not look at me. She dropped the photographs. They fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing face up, displaying the undeniable proof of her husband's betrayal. She slowly turned to face Brad. The shock in her eyes had completely burned away, leaving nothing but a raw, blinding, absolute rage. You brought that woman into my brother's life. Tara screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. You slept with her in our bed. Brad reached out, trying to grab her shoulders to placate her. Baby, please, it meant nothing. I love you. I swear, I love you. The sound of the slap was deafening. It echoed like a gunshot in the pristine office. Tara swung her arm with every ounce of fury in her body, striking Brad squarely across the face. His head snapped to the side, a bright red handprint instantly blooming across his pale cheek. He stumbled sideways, clutching his jaw, completely stunned by the physical impact. But Tara was not finished. She lunged at him, her manicured nails clawing at his chest, pounding her fists against his shoulders, screaming incoherently as the absolute magnitude of the betrayal consumed her. You disgusting, pathetic piece of trash! Tara shrieked, hitting him again and again as he scrambled backward, trying to shield his face. You ruined my family. You destroyed my brother's life. I gave you everything. We paid for everything. I stood perfectly still, watching the family that had terrorized me for 7 years completely eat itself alive right in the middle of my office. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice. They were tearing each other apart with their own bare hands, driven mad by the very lies and secrets they had used to build their fake, arrogant lives. Brad managed to push Tara away, stumbling backward until his back hit the heavy oak door. He looked at me, blood trickling from a small scratch on his cheek, his eyes filled with a terror he would carry for the rest of his life. You can take this domestic dispute to the parking lot, I announced coldly, my voice cutting through Tara's hysterical sobbing. But before you go and call your divorce lawyers, Tara, you should probably ask your husband exactly how he paid for that brand new Porsche Carrera sitting in your driveway. Tara froze, turning her tear-stained face toward me. Because Brad did not buy that car with his startup revenue, I stated, sealing the coffin shut. He bought it with $200,000 of stolen corporate funds. Funds that Marcus explicitly embezzled from his employer to keep Brad quiet about the affair. Your husband is not just a cheating, lying parasite, Tara. He is a criminal accessory to massive corporate fraud. Tara let out a guttural, agonizing scream. She turned back to Brad, but he was already opening the door, scrambling out into the hallway like a cornered rat fleeing the absolute devastation he had caused. Tara ran after him, her sobs echoing down the corridor as she chased the man who had burned her life to the ground. I watched them disappear, the heavy mahogany door slowly swinging shut behind them. The room fell silent once again. I looked down at the glossy photographs scattered across the hardwood floor. The elite Washington family had officially been pruned. There was only one step left in this execution. It was time to deal the final fatal blow to Marcus's career. The camera cuts sharply from the quiet dominance of my corner office, plunging directly into a frantic, chaotic tracking shot moving at breakneck speed. We are no longer in a space of calculated silence. We are inside the suffocating, panic-induced nightmare of Marcus Washington. The lens is positioned tightly behind Marcus's right shoulder, shaking slightly as it follows him, sprinting through the underground VIP parking garage of his prestigious Midtown Atlanta investment firm. His leased luxury sedan is parked diagonally across two executive spaces, the driver's side door left wide open, with the engine still ticking. Marcus is completely unraveling. The perfectly tailored, arrogant senior director, who had confidently demanded $12 million from me just an hour ago, is entirely gone. His expensive silk tie is yanked loose around his neck. He is sweating profusely, large dark patches blooming under the arms of his designer dress shirt. He is breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, his chest heaving as he runs toward the private glass elevator bank. Marcus knows he is out of time. The red folder I slid across the mediation table is burning a hole in his mind. He knows that the forensic accounting dossier contains every wire transfer, every fake vendor invoice, and every dollar he embezzled to fund his double life. I gave him a choice to walk away with nothing but. Marcus is a man driven by greed and a profound inability to accept defeat. He believes he can outsmart the executioner. His desperate, frantic plan is incredibly simple. He just needs to reach his workstation on the 50th floor. If he can log into his secure trading terminal before the close of the business day, he can access a secondary holding account. He plans to liquidate $2 million, authorize a massive untraceable wire transfer to an offshore shell company he set up in Chloe's name, grab his passport from his desk drawer, and completely vanish from the country. He thinks he can outrun the federal indictments. He thinks he can flee before I send that red folder to his chief executive officer tomorrow morning. The camera tracks him closely as he bursts through the heavy glass doors leading from the parking garage into the grand, multi-story marble lobby of the investment fund. The lobby is bustling with late-afternoon corporate activity. Analysts in sharp suits, wealthy clients, and administrative staff are milling about the sunlit atrium. Marcus ignores all of them. He keeps his head down, practically shoving past a junior broker who politely tries to greet him. His eyes are locked obsessively on the secure biometric turnstiles guarding the express elevators to the executive suites. He reaches the security gate, practically slamming his body against the stainless steel barrier. He rips his corporate identification lanyard from his belt and slaps the heavy plastic badge against the sleek black RFID reader. He expects the familiar welcoming green flash and the soft click of the glass gates parting to let him through. He expects the building to acknowledge his status, his title, and his unearned authority. Instead, a harsh electronic buzz pierces the air. The LED indicator on the scanner flashes a violent, glaring crimson red. Marcus freezes his hand, still pressing the badge against the scanner. He stares at the red light, his brain refusing to process the denial. He mutters a frustrated curse, wiping the surface of the badge aggressively against his slacks, convincing himself it is just a microscopic smudge on the magnetic strip. He slaps the badge against the reader a second time. The harsh buzz repeats. The light flashes red again. Access denied. Panic begins to claw its way up his throat. He steps back, pulling out his smartphone with trembling hands. The firm utilizes a secure digital key application as a backup for executives. He frantically taps the screen, his thumb slipping on the glass because his palms are dripping with cold sweat. He opens the application, expecting to generate a temporary barcode. Instead, he is met with a stark gray login screen displaying a single sentence in bold text. Account suspended. Please contact Human Resources immediately. Marcus feels the floor drop entirely out from under him. The pristine marble lobby suddenly feels like a tightening trash compactor. He looks up and spots Dave, the head of building security. Dave is a stoic, broad-shouldered man whom Marcus has spent the last 5 years treating like an invisible servant. Marcus never learned Dave's last name. He never said good morning. He only ever snapped his fingers when he wanted the elevator held open. Now Marcus needs him. He abandons the turnstile and marches over to the main security desk, slapping his palm flat on the granite counter. Dave, open the manual gate right now, Marcus barks, trying desperately to project the booming, authoritative voice of a senior director. My badge is malfunctioning and the IT department has completely messed up the network. I have a critical time-sensitive international conference call on the 50th floor in exactly 4 minutes. Open the gate. Dave does not flinch. He does not reach for the manual override button beneath his desk. He simply looks at Marcus with a blank, entirely unbothered expression. I cannot do that, Mr. Washington. Dave replies, his voice steady and strictly professional. Your credentials have been systematically flagged in the mainframe. Your building access has been entirely revoked. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow to the chest, but his toxic ego immediately rejects the reality of the situation. He refuses to accept that his power has been stripped away. He leans aggressively over the high counter, invading the security guard's personal space, his face twisted in a mask of absolute aristocratic rage. Do you have any idea who you are talking to? Marcus screams, his voice cracking and echoing loudly across the vast marble lobby. Dozens of employees and clients stop dead in their tracks, turning their heads to watch the golden boy of the investment fund suffer a complete, spectacular mental breakdown in public. I am a senior director of this institution. Marcus continues to roar, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. I manage billions of dollars in real estate portfolios. I generate more revenue for this building in a week than you will see in your entire pathetic lifetime. You do not deny me access. You press that button, you open that gate, and you let me up to my office right this second, or I swear I will have you fired and blacklisted from every security firm in the state of Georgia. Dave remains completely unfazed by the tantrum. He casually reaches down and taps the radio clip to his belt, signaling for backup. Within seconds, 2 more heavily built security officers step out from the shadows of the elevator bank, positioning themselves strategically behind Marcus. Sir, I am going to have to ask you to step away from the desk and lower your voice, Dave instructs coldly. If you do not comply, we will be forced to physically remove you from the premises. Marcus is hyperventilating now. The walls are closing in. His master plan of wiring $2 million offshore is evaporating right in front of his eyes. He spins around, realizing he is completely surrounded by security guards he used to look down on. He looks at the crowd of his own colleagues, whispering and pointing their smartphones at him, recording his absolute degradation. This is a mistake, Marcus shrieks, pointing wildly toward the ceiling. Someone in Human Resources made a catastrophic error. Get Richard Sterling down here right now. Call the chief executive officer. Call the chairman of the board. Bring the chairman down to this lobby immediately so he can fire every single one of you incompetent fools. I demand to see the chairman. Marcus stands in the center of the atrium, sweating, screaming, and unraveling completely. He points directly at the private VIP executive elevator, the one reserved exclusively for the C-suite executives and board members. You call the chairman. Marcus bellows, his voice hoarse and desperate. Right on cue, as if the universe itself is answering his pathetic demand, the digital display above the private executive elevator illuminates. The numbers begin to tick down from the 50th floor. 45, 40, 30. Marcus turns his attention to the descending elevator, a manic, triumphant grin spreading across his sweaty face. He points at the stainless steel doors, looking back at the security guards with wild, unhinged eyes. You see that Marcus laughs a breathless, panicked sound. That is the chairman coming down right now. He is coming down here to personally escort me up to my terminal, and you are all going to be standing in the unemployment line by 5 o'clock. The numbers above the elevator continue to drop. 10, 5, 2, 1. The soft melodic chime of the executive elevator rings out through the dead silent lobby. The heavy polished steel doors smoothly slide open. Marcus straightens his tie with trembling hands, plastering on a fake desperate smile, preparing to greet his boss and beg for his access card to be reinstated. He takes a step forward, but it is not the chairman of the board standing inside the elevator car. The polished steel doors slide completely open. A gorgeous, seamless dolly track begins to roll in my mind, capturing the absolute cinematic perfection of the moment. I am standing dead center in the mahogany-paneled elevator car. I am wearing a tailored, brilliant white double-breasted suit that cuts through the drab gray and navy of the corporate lobby like a bolt of lightning. I am not alone. Flanking my right is Harrison Vance, the man Marcus just desperately demanded to see the former chairman of the board. On my left is a tight phalanx of top-tier corporate litigators and senior board members, all carrying thick leather binders and wearing expressions of severe, uncompromising authority. I step over the threshold. My heels strike the marble floor with a sharp, echoing crack. The camera tracks backward, keeping me perfectly centered in the frame as I lead the most powerful men in the building out of the elevator. They do not walk ahead of me. They do not even walk beside me. They follow exactly half a step behind a silent, undeniable visual confirmation of the new hierarchy. Marcus drops his pointing finger. The manic, triumphant grin practically melts off his sweating face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. He looks at me pristine and untouchable in my white suit, and then he looks at the army of executives standing in my shadow. His brain simply cannot process the image. It defies every single narrative of superiority he has spent his entire life constructing. "You asked for the chairman, Marcus," I announce, my voice projecting effortlessly across the cavernous lobby. Every single employee, client, and security guard in the atrium holds their collective breath, so here I am. Marcus physically stumbles backward, bumping into the granite security desk. He looks frantically at the older man standing to my right. "Harrison, what is she doing here?" Marcus begs, his voice cracking with panic. "Why is my wife coming out of the executive elevator? Get her out of my building. Tell security to throw her out. She is having a mental breakdown over our divorce." Harrison does not flinch. The older, wealthy white man, whom Marcus has spent 5 years desperately trying to impress, looks at Marcus with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. Harrison turns his head slightly, looking at me for silent permission to speak. I grant it with a fraction of a nod. "You need to address the chairwoman with respect," Marcus Harrison states coldly, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. "And she is not having a breakdown. She is conducting a corporate audit." Marcus stops breathing. His eyes dart wildly between Harrison and me. The words hang in the air, refusing to compute in his fragile, terrified mind. Chairwoman. I take a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. The crowd of junior brokers and administrative staff parts for me, like the Red Sea. I am pacing slowly around him now, a predator circling a wounded, bleeding seal. "I forgot to mention a minor detail during our little mediation session last week, Marcus." I smile smoothly, letting the razor-sharp edge of my tone slice through the silence. That London merger I finalized, the one that dissolved my domestic company and locked my wealth in an offshore trust, that was only phase 1 of the acquisition strategy. I pause, letting him suffocate on the anticipation. Phase 2 involved my new overseas conglomerate diversifying its global portfolio. I explain, speaking slowly and clearly so that every single one of his colleagues can hear exactly how I outplayed him. We recognized that this specific Atlanta-based investment fund had excellent market positioning, but it suffered from catastrophic, deeply negligent mid-level management. So my board executed a hostile takeover. We quietly leveraged our capital and acquired a 51% controlling stake in this very firm. The ink on the final regulatory filings dried yesterday morning. Marcus is hyperventilating. His hands are shaking so violently, he drops his leather briefcase to the marble floor. It lands with a heavy, humiliating thud. "I am your new chairwoman, Marcus," I state, standing directly in front of him, forcing him to look into the eyes of the black woman he thought he could discard and destroy. "I own the controlling shares of this building. I own your department. And I currently own your employment contract." "You cannot do this." Marcus gasps, his chest heaving as he shakes his head in frantic denial. "This is illegal. It is a conflict of interest. You cannot buy my company just to fire me. I will sue the board. I will go to the federal regulators." I let out a soft, mocking laugh. "You really think I spent millions of dollars acquiring a company just to settle a domestic dispute?" I asked, tilting my head. "Please, Marcus, do not flatter yourself. You are not worth a fraction of this firm's valuation. I bought this company because it is highly profitable. I am firing you because you are a liability and a thief." I snap my fingers. One of the corporate litigators standing behind me immediately steps forward, opening a thick leather binder. He hands me a crisp, highly detailed financial dossier. It is an exact replica of the bright red folder I showed Marcus in the mediation room, only this one has the official seal of the corporate auditing department stamped on the cover. When I took over as majority shareholder, my first order of business was initiating a comprehensive forensic audit of all secondary tier holding accounts. I announced raising the dossier for the entire lobby to see. As the chairwoman, it is my fiduciary duty to protect the assets of my investors, and my auditors took a very close look at the operational liquidities you manage. You know the accounts you use to secretly wire funds to your mistress, the accounts you use to buy Chloe's Mercedes-Benz, the accounts you used to fund Brad's pathetic failing startup because you wanted to play the wealthy benefactor to your white brother-in-law. A collective gasp ripples through the crowd of employees. The junior brokers who used to fetch Marcus's coffee are now staring at him like he is radioactive. "You did not just steal from your employer, Marcus." I continue, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "You stole from me, because I own this company now. Every dollar you embezzled over the last 8 months was effectively stolen directly from my corporate pockets. You thought you were so clever siphoning cash to fund your double life, but you were just leaving a perfectly illuminated paper trail leading straight to a federal indictment." Marcus falls to his knees. His legs simply give out beneath him. The arrogant chest-puffing executive is entirely gone. He is kneeling on the cold floor of his own lobby, weeping openly in front of the colleagues he spent years trying to dominate. "Nia, please." Marcus sobs, reaching a trembling hand out toward the hem of my white trousers. "I will pay it back. I swear I will pay back every single cent. Do not send me to prison. I have a baby. Chloe cannot raise a child alone. Please, I am begging you. Have some mercy." I look down at him. I do not step back. I do not flinch. I stand my ground and look at the pathetic, broken man crying at my feet. "You wanted mercy, Marcus?" I ask softly, my tone devoid of a single ounce of compassion. "You should have thought about mercy when you moved your 24-year-old intern into my house. You should have thought about mercy when you demanded $12 million of my hard-earned money to raise a child that is not even yours." I turn my gaze away from him, looking directly at Dave, the security guard, who had refused to open the gate just minutes prior. "Dave," I command, projecting my voice across the atrium. "Mr. Washington's employment is officially terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. His pension is entirely seized to cover the stolen funds. His stock options are permanently voided. His severance package is exactly 0. I look back down at Marcus one last time, delivering the final fatal blow to his corporate existence. "You are no longer a senior director, Marcus. You are a trespasser." I look up at the security team, giving the final execution order. "Get this garbage out of my building." I turn my back on Marcus. The camera executes a slow, deliberate crane shot rising high above the cavernous marble lobby to capture a god's eye view of the absolute destruction. From this vantage point, Marcus looks incredibly small. a tiny, insignificant speck kneeling on the polished floor, completely surrounded by the towering architecture of the empire he tried to steal. Dave, the head of security, does not hesitate. He gestures to the two heavily built officers standing by. They step forward, each taking one of Marcus's arms. They do not handle him with the gentle deference usually afforded to a senior director. They haul him to his feet with rough, uncompromising efficiency. Marcus struggles, his legs refusing to support his weight. He looks wild, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie hanging loose around his neck. He is gasping for air, the reality of his total annihilation finally crushing the breath out of his lungs. "Nia!" Marcus screams, his voice tearing through the silent lobby, echoing off the high ceilings. "Nia, please. You cannot do this. We can fix this. I am sorry. I will do whatever you want. Please." I do not turn around. I keep walking toward the bank of private executive elevators, my white suit a stark contrast against the dark mahogany panels. Harrison Vance, the former chairman, falls into step beside me, along with my legal team. Marcus's frantic pleas grow louder, more desperate, as the security guards begin to physically drag him toward the main exit. "I have a son!" Marcus wails, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched sob. "You are leaving my son with nothing. You are a monster, Nia. You are a cold-blooded monster." I stop. The camera holds steady on my profile. I slowly turn my head, looking back over my shoulder at the man who had spent 7 years trying to make me feel inadequate. I do not raise my voice. I do not need to. The entire lobby is hanging on my every word. "You should have thought about your son before you decided to steal from the woman paying for your life," I state, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "And for the record, Marcus, I am not a monster. I am just the consequences of your own actions." I turn back toward the elevator. The doors glide open and I step inside, Harrison and the board members following me. As the doors begin to close, I catch one last glimpse of Marcus being shoved through the revolving glass doors of the building out into the sweltering Atlanta heat, completely stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity. In the span of exactly 72 hours, Marcus Washington had lost his $3 million mansion, his access to my bank accounts, and his prestigious corporate career. He had walked into this week believing he was a king who could casually discard his queen. He was walking out as a broke, unemployed trespasser, facing federal indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement. The elevator ascends smoothly to the 50th floor. Harrison looks at me, a mixture of profound respect and slight apprehension in his eyes. "That was remarkably efficient," Madam Chairwoman Harrison notes, adjusting his tie. "The board was aware of the embezzlement, of course, but the execution was flawless." "I do not tolerate liabilities in my portfolio, Harrison," I reply, looking straight ahead at the digital floor indicator. And Marcus was the biggest liability of all. I step out of the elevator and walk into my new corner office. The view of the Atlanta skyline is breathtaking. I sit down behind the massive executive desk, feeling the cool leather of the chair. The third phase of the takeover is complete, but the final, most devastating blow has not yet been struck. Marcus still clings to one fragile delusion. He still believes that despite losing his money and his career, he has won the ultimate prize. He still believes he has his true heir. He still believes the child Chloe gave birth to is his legacy. It is time to burn that final delusion to ash. It is time to show Marcus that the family he destroyed his marriage for was built on a lie far more insidious than anything he could have ever imagined. 3 days passed since Marcus was escorted out of his own lobby. For 72 hours, my phone had been silent, filtering his blocked calls into a digital void. But desperate men always find a way to crawl back. He started calling my assistant Maya from a prepaid mobile phone, leaving frantic, weeping voicemails begging for just 10 minutes of my time. He claimed he wanted to apologize. He claimed he wanted to negotiate a peaceful surrender. I knew better. Marcus did not want peace. He wanted a lifeline. I instructed Maya to arrange a meeting at a quiet, upscale cafe tucked away in a discreet corner of Midtown Atlanta. I chose the location deliberately. It was public enough to prevent him from causing a violent scene, but exclusive enough to ensure our conversation would not end up on a local gossip blog. I stepped out of my car wearing a camel-colored cashmere trench coat and oversized designer sunglasses. The afternoon sun was bright, casting long shadows across the pavement. I walked into the cafe, the bell above the door chiming softly. The air smelled of roasted espresso and expensive pastries. I spotted them immediately sitting in a corner booth. Marcus looked like a man who had not slept or showered in 3 days. The sharp, arrogant executive who used to spend an hour meticulously grooming his beard was completely gone. He was wearing a wrinkled pullover, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark, heavy bags. Sitting next to him, looking like a terrified hostage, was Chloe. She was bouncing a high-end luxury stroller with one hand looking exhausted and entirely out of her depth. The reality of dating a broke, unemployed man facing federal indictment had clearly destroyed the glamorous illusion she had bought into. I walked over and slid gracefully into the leather booth opposite them. I did not take off my sunglasses. I did not order a drink. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited. Nia Marcus began, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Thank you for coming. I know you did not have to." "You have exactly 5 minutes, Marcus." I stated, my tone perfectly flat. "Do not waste them on fake pleasantries. What do you want?" He swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Chloe before looking back at me. "I want to make a deal. I will sign whatever non-disclosure agreements you want. I will walk away from the divorce without asking for a single penny. I will disappear. Just please, Nia, please call off the corporate auditors. Tell the board not to press federal charges for the embezzlement. If you hand that file over to the authorities, I am going to federal prison. I will not survive in there." I tilted my head slightly, studying the pathetic broken shell of my former husband. "You stole $200,000 from a heavily regulated financial institution to buy designer purses and fund your white brother-in-law's failed startup," I replied smoothly. "That is a federal crime, Marcus. As the chairwoman of the board, I have a strict fiduciary duty to my shareholders. If I sweep your theft under the rug, I become legally complicit in your fraud. I am not risking my freedom and my empire to save a man who tried to leave me with nothing." Chloe let out a quiet, terrified whimper, clutching the edge of the table. "Marcus, you promised she would drop the charges," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You said she just wanted the house back. You said you could fix this." "Shut up, Chloe." Marcus snapped, the venom instantly returning to his voice. He turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes back to me. "Nia, I have a baby. Look at him." He pointed a shaking finger at the stroller. "You cannot send a father to prison. You cannot leave my son to grow up visiting me through a glass partition. You have won everything else. You took my job. You took my home. You froze my accounts. You stripped me of my dignity. Is that not enough for you?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a lethal, quiet register. "You did all of that to yourself, Marcus. I just handed you the mirror." The reality of his absolute destruction finally crashed down on him. The pleading vanished. The desperate, groveling man disappeared, instantly replaced by the toxic, egotistical narcissist I had been married to for 7 years. When Marcus realized he could not manipulate his way out of the consequences, his fragile pride demanded blood. He needed to hurt me. He needed to find the one vulnerability he believed I harbored, the one societal expectation he thought could shatter my armor. He sat back in the booth, crossing his arms over his wrinkled shirt. A nasty, bitter smirk twisted his lips, contorting his face into an ugly mask of spite. "You think you are a queen because you have money?" Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "You think buying my company and stealing my house makes you a winner? But look at you, Nia. Look at your life. You are 34 years old and you are completely alone." I did not break eye contact. I let him dig the hole deeper. "You have $20 million in a bank account, but you have no one to come home to," Marcus continued, leaning aggressively across the table. "You are a cold, barren, lonely woman. You were so obsessed with sitting in boardrooms and playing the corporate boss that your own body failed you. You could not do the one natural thing a woman is supposed to do. You could not give me a family. You could not give me a legacy." Chloe shifted uncomfortably, looking down at her lap, but Marcus was entirely consumed by his own hateful monologue. He gestured grandly toward the stroller beside him, a twisted pride illuminating his exhausted features. I might have lost my money, Nia, but at least I have a son. Marcus boasted, his voice rising loud enough to draw the attention of the barista across the room. At least I have my true heir to carry on my name. Chloe gave me the one thing your money could never buy. She gave me blood. She gave me a real family. In 20 years, I will have a son who looks at me and calls me father. And you will just be an aging, bitter woman sitting alone in a sterile penthouse counting your money until the day you die with absolutely no one to remember your name. He let out a sharp, arrogant laugh, genuinely believing he had just delivered a fatal blow to my psyche. He thought he had exposed my greatest shame. He thought weaponizing his illegitimate child would break my spirit right there in the middle of the cafe. He expected me to flinch, to look away, to show even a fraction of the devastating pain he wanted to inflict. Instead, I reached into my camel-colored trench coat. I felt the smooth, crisp edges of the heavy white envelope waiting inside my pocket. I did not feel a single ounce of pain. I felt the terrifying, absolute thrill of an apex predator about to snap its jaws shut. Marcus had proudly built his entire remaining identity on the foundation of that baby. He was using that child as a shield to protect his shattered ego. It was finally time to show my soon-to-be ex-husband that his grand, unbreakable legacy was nothing but the most humiliating, tragic joke of the century. I pulled the heavy, crisp white envelope from the deep pocket of my camel-colored cashmere trench coat. I placed it flat on the wooden cafe table, keeping my manicured hand resting gently on top of it. The camera in my mind executed a flawless, agonizingly slow push in on the stark white paper, a glaring contrast against the dark mahogany surface. I looked across the table at the man who had just tried to strip me of my womanhood, a man who actually believed his biological ability to procreate made him superior to the empire I had built. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I let a soft, melodic laugh escape my lips. It was not a laugh of pain or defensiveness. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated pity. A true heir, I repeated, shaking my head slightly as I looked at him. You are so utterly blinded by your own fragile masculinity, Marcus, that you actually believe the garbage falling out of your mouth. You think you are the patriarchal mastermind of a grand new dynasty. I slid the white envelope across the table. It stopped precisely an inch away from his coffee cup. Are you absolutely sure about that, Marcus? I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. Are you sure about your bloodline? Marcus stared at the envelope. The arrogant, spiteful smirk that had twisted his face just moments ago began to waver. He looked at Chloe. She had suddenly gone perfectly still, her face draining of all color. She was staring at the white envelope with an expression of sheer, unmitigated terror. Open it, I commanded, projecting absolute authority. Marcus reached out with trembling fingers. He tore open the flap and pulled out a multi-page document featuring the official embossed letterhead of an elite certified clinical genetics laboratory. His bloodshot eyes scanned the first page, trying to make sense of the complex medical terminology and genetic markers. When I hired my private investigator 8 months ago, I told you I do not do anything halfway, I explained, leaning back against the leather booth. I look at every single variable in a corporate acquisition, and a hostile takeover of a marriage is absolutely no different. I needed to know exactly what kind of liability I was dealing with, so I had my investigator follow Chloe very, very closely. Marcus flipped to the second page. His breath hitched audibly in his throat. My investigator is incredibly thorough. I continued, smoothly savoring every single second of his impending destruction. He waited outside the delivery ward last month. Medical waste is considered public domain once it hits the exterior disposal bins. It took him exactly 20 minutes to bribe a sanitation worker and retrieve the discarded umbilical cord stump from Chloe's delivery room. Chloe let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She slapped a hand over her mouth, shrinking back against the vinyl booth as if trying to merge with the wall. Getting the second genetic sample was even easier, I said, smiling coldly. Do you remember when I kicked you all out of my house? Brad was standing on my front porch holding a craft beer. When he panicked and scrambled out to his car, he dropped the bottle in my driveway. I simply bagged it, swabbed it for his saliva, and sent it straight to the lab along with the umbilical cord. Marcus froze. He stopped breathing entirely. His eyes were locked on the bold black text printed at the very bottom of the third page. The paper in his hands began to shake violently. "The test results are mathematically indisputable," Marcus Buffy stated, driving the final fatal nail directly into his coffin. "That baby sitting in that luxury stroller next to you is a 99.9% genetic match to your sister's husband. That is Brad's biological son." The silence that fell over the cafe booth was deafening. It was the sound of a man's entire universe imploding into a microscopic point of absolute nothingness. Marcus stared at the paper, his mind desperately trying to reject the reality printed in black and white. He slowly turned his head to look at Chloe. "Chloe," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a wounded, dying animal. "Tell me this is a lie. Tell me she faked this." Chloe burst into violent, hysterical tears. She shrank away from him, pulling the stroller closer to her body. "Marcus, I am sorry," she sobbed, the confession tumbling out of her mouth before she could even try to formulate a lie. "It was a mistake. Brad told me he was going to leave Tara. He promised he would take care of me. But then his company went under and he said he had no money. He told me to go to the networking event. He told me to talk to you because you were a senior director. He said you would pay for everything." She had just handed him the entire devastating truth on a silver platter. I leaned forward, making sure Marcus heard every single word I was about to say. Brad could not afford to keep his 24-year-old mistress happy on a failing startup budget, I explained, twisting the knife deep into his shattered ego. So he brought her to a corporate event and dangled her in front of the easiest, most insecure mark in the room. You. Brad passed his pregnant mistress off to you, Marcus. He let you buy her a Mercedes-Benz with embezzled funds. He let you pay for her boutique hotel rooms. He let you completely destroy your marriage, your reputation, and your freedom. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over his ruined, pathetic posture. You abandoned a brilliant, loyal black wife who built you an empire, I said, my voice ringing with righteous, absolute finality. And you did it so you could bankrupt yourself, raising a white child fathered by your racist, freeloading brother-in-law. You sacrificed a queen to protect a pawn, and the pawn belonged to the man you secretly despise. You are the ultimate fool, Marcus. You have absolutely no legacy. Something inside Marcus completely snapped. The realization of his absolute, profound humiliation broke whatever fragile tether was keeping him anchored to sanity. He was not just a thief or a cheater anymore. He was a spectacular, monumental joke. Brad had played him for an absolute fool, using him as a walking wallet to fund a secret life. Marcus let out a guttural, blood-curdling roar. He slammed his fists upward, catching the edge of the heavy wooden cafe table. He flipped the entire table over with a violent surge of adrenaline. Coffee mugs shattered against the tile floor. Silverware clattered loudly. Other patrons in the cafe screamed and scrambled out of their seats. "You ruined my life!" Marcus screamed. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He lunged across the shattered debris, throwing his entire body weight toward Chloe. He grabbed her by the collar of her shirt, slamming her back against the vinyl booth. Chloe shrieked in absolute terror, throwing her arms up to shield her face as Marcus drew his fist back. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I calmly took 2 steps backward, smoothing the front of my cashmere coat, and watched the trap spring perfectly shut. "Police, get your hands behind your back right now." 2 men who had been sitting quietly at the adjacent booth holding newspapers suddenly sprang into action. They were not ordinary patrons. They were plainclothes police officers. I had called the precinct an hour before the meeting, providing them with Marcus's location and a warning that a desperate man facing federal embezzlement charges was likely to become violent. The officers tackled Marcus from behind. They slammed him face first into the shattered ceramic and spilled coffee on the floor. Marcus thrashed wildly, screaming Chloe's name, screaming Brad's name, cursing the entire world for a destruction he had entirely orchestrated himself. "Stop resisting," the officer barked, pressing his knee firmly between Marcus's shoulder blades. He yanked Marcus's arms backward, and the sharp, definitive click of steel handcuffs echoed through the chaotic cafe. "You are under arrest for assault and disturbing the peace." They hauled Marcus to his feet. His face was scraped and bleeding from the broken coffee mugs. His clothes were soaked in espresso. He looked like a feral, broken animal. He locked eyes with me as the officers began to drag him toward the exit. "Nia!" Marcus screamed, his voice raw and tearing at his vocal cords. "Nia, please." I stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage. I looked at the man who had tried to bury me, the man who had weaponized my womanhood and tried to steal my empire. "You wanted a legacy, Marcus?" I said clearly, ensuring my voice cut through his pathetic sobbing. "Enjoy your cell." I turned my back on him. I did not look at Chloe, who was weeping hysterically beside her luxury stroller. I simply buttoned my camel coat, stepped over the broken glass, and walked out the front door of the cafe into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight. The execution was completely, undeniably finished. I walked out into the bright Atlanta sunlight and did not look back. That was 6 months ago. The camera in my mind transitions, cutting away from the chaotic streets of Midtown and returning to the quiet, untouchable sanctuary of my penthouse. The lighting is low, casting warm gold and deep burgundy shadows across the stunning abstract art on my walls. I am sitting cross-legged on my velvet armchair exactly where this story began. I raise my crystal glass, the amber liquid catching the dim light, and take a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon. The camera begins a flawlessly smooth, incredibly slow pull-out shot, widening the frame to capture the absolute peace of a woman who has successfully defended her empire against an army of parasites. The dust settled exactly as I engineered it. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Marcus never stood a chance. The federal prosecutors received my meticulously documented red folder, and they did not offer him a polite corporate exit or a quiet plea deal. They offered him a trial that dismantled the last remaining shreds of his pride. He stood in a sterile federal courtroom wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, a far cry from the custom Italian suits he used to lease with my money. The judge handed down a sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate embezzlement and aggravated assault. He lost his freedom, his reputation, and his delusions of grandeur. He went from claiming a fraudulent legacy to becoming just another inmate number in the federal system. He will spend the next half-decade sitting in a concrete cell agonizing over the empire he threw away for a naive intern. His sister Tara, fueled by the explosive revelation in my office, unleashed a scorched earth divorce on Brad. She hired the most aggressive legal sharks in Atlanta and completely cleaned him out. Brad lost the Porsche, the house, and every single dime he had hidden away in his failing startup accounts. The arrogant white man who loved to weaponize racial stereotypes and play the enlightened mediator was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the crushing reality of his own pathetic betrayal. Without Brad's stolen money to fund her lifestyle, Chloe's glamorous illusion shattered instantly. Brad abandoned her and the baby the exact moment his own bank accounts were seized by Tara's lawyers. Chloe quickly learned that bagging a wealthy executive requires the executive to actually possess his own wealth. The luxury strollers, the diamond tennis bracelets, and the boutique hotel rooms vanished overnight. Today, if you drive through a specific fast food chain on the dusty outskirts of the city, you might see her. She wears a grease-stained uniform and hands cheap paper bags out of a drive-through window, working double shifts to support the child she thought was her golden ticket to high society. She gambled her youth on the wrong men, tried to play a game completely out of her league, and lost spectacularly. But perhaps the most poetic justice of all fell upon Beatrice. The bank foreclosed on her sprawling suburban home exactly 30 days after I froze the operational accounts. I made sure to drive past her neighborhood on the crisp Tuesday morning the county sheriffs arrived to enforce the eviction notice. Beatrice stood on the sidewalk, clutching her oversized crocodile skin handbag, crying hysterically as she watched moving men carry her outdated furniture and cheap floral dresses out onto the curb. She now lives in a cramped government-subsidized Section 8 apartment complex on the other side of town. She spends her days sitting on a worn-out sofa, desperately dialing the numbers of the wealthy women who used to serve on prestigious charity boards with her. Every single call goes straight to voicemail. The elite Atlanta society she worshipped completely shunned her the moment her bank accounts hit zero and her son's mugshot hit the evening news. She is entirely invisible to the world she prioritized over basic human decency. She has no galas, no country club memberships, and no wealthy daughter-in-law to bully. She has nothing but the four walls of a low-income apartment and the agonizing memory of the kingdom she helped her son destroy. I swirl the bourbon in my glass, listening to the ice clink gently against the heavy crystal. The camera continues its slow, steady pull-out, emphasizing the vast, quiet luxury of my penthouse. I did not just survive their betrayal, I orchestrated their absolute ruin using nothing but the very truth they tried so desperately to hide. I took back my company, I protected my wealth, and I excised the rot from my life with surgical precision. I looked directly into the lens, my expression perfectly serene. They tell Black women to be graceful. They tell us to be forgiving. They expect us to carry the weight of mediocre men, to smile through the blatant disrespect, and to endlessly compromise our own brilliance to protect their fragile egos. They demand that we turn the other cheek when our empires are threatened, telling us that holding on to our anger makes us bitter. I take one final sip of my drink, letting the warmth settle in my chest. But the greatest grace you can give yourself is stepping back and letting your enemies drown in the ocean of their own greed. Case closed. The screen cuts to black.